So welcome everybody to this panel that raises the question, what makes a healthy public sphere? We will connect to the questions we raised yesterday about what is a public sphere actually, right? So we need to define public spheres and then ask what are the qualities that we need to improve to keep the public sphere alive, to keep a healthy public sphere. My name is Hans Asenbaum. I'm a senior research fellow at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance. And I'm joined here by 4 fantastic speakers who will report on their different research, different aspects of a healthy public sphere. So first, we'll hear from Professor Selen Ercan. She's the director of the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. And she's the chief investigator of the Australian Research Council Discovery Project, Democratic Resilience, the Public Sphere, and Extremist Attacks. And she will report on this project, and she will answer a question that has been in the room yesterday quite a lot. What actually is deliberative democracy? So she will unpack this ideal of deliberative democracy, the normative aspects, a little bit. And then we'll pass it over to Jordan McSwiney, who is a postdoctoral fellow at our Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance. Jordan, I need to emphasize that you've just published a book, Far-Right Political Parties in Australia, Disorganization and Electoral Failure. So I'll encourage you all to look up Jordan's new book. And he will also talk about the Democratic Resilience Project and report on the empirical side of the project, empirical findings, and ask how leaders in the public sphere in different democracies react to extremist attacks. Then we'll hand over to Ehsan Dehghan here at my side. He's a senior lecturer in digital media at the School of Communication here at QUT and a chief investigator at the Digital Media Research Center. And Ehsan will talk about agonistic democracy, so bringing in a different aspect, a different version of how we can theoretically and make sense of the public sphere, draw on agonistic pluralism in contrast to deliberative democracy, and maybe we'll hear about some of the differences, but also where the two ideals intersect. And finally, we'll pass it over to Michelle Riedlinger, who is associate professor here at QUT School of Communication. And Michelle, you will talk about independent fact-checking, so turning to a very concrete, very important issue of disinformation, misinformation, and what that does to the health of the public sphere. So regarding the procedure, I thought we could mix it up a little bit. We'll first hear from the panel, and then we'll pass it over to you. You will engage in small group discussions at your table. So discuss whatever questions came up for you, whichever comments, ideas came up for you. I'll give you about 15 minutes, and then we'll turn back to the panel, and you'll raise your questions and comments to the panel. So without any further ado, I'll pass it over to Selen and ask you what makes a healthy public sphere.
Thank you so much. Thanks again to the organizers for organizing this fantastic workshop. And I'm excited to be here with the co-panelists speaking to this important topic and the public sphere more broadly, because as Hans mentioned, we have an ARC discovery project that has been going on, which is on the public sphere. And so this workshop for me is really like Alice in Wonderland. So all the sort of questions I've been asking myself and thinking about the project are also reflected here in this workshop. So I guess I just want to maybe, we are given just 5 minutes each, and I'm trying to be short because I'm interested in the communication rather than my own presentation only. So I will maybe build on some insights from yesterday. My research and my work on the public sphere builds very much on the complementary approaches presented yesterday by John and Axel, an understanding of the public sphere as a network of communication where the public opinion is formed, and in functional, well-functioning public spheres, this public opinion influences the decision-making, where there is an uptake of this public opinion. And we could see, for example, on a topic like climate change, in many democracies, the public sphere is ahead of decision makers. Like the public is ahead on that particular topic, but there is no uptake. So we could think about the functionality of that kind of public sphere. But I guess thinking about also John's work and Axel's work, thinking about the public sphere like the media, the traditional media, but also the digital public sphere, having this larger, big view of the public sphere, I want to add to their approaches that it's a site where communication happens not only through text and talk, but there's a lot of nonverbal expression in the contemporary public spheres as well. For example, visuals play a huge role, and information and communication technologies and the use of social media and the papers presented yesterday really bring this kind of point to the fore for me. So when we are thinking about the contemporary public sphere, we need to go beyond the textual and talk-centric approach to public sphere, or have a broader understanding of the talk, including the visual, nonverbal, sonic, etc. Because I think, to me, this is what the key additionality of the digital platforms are. So that's sort of one addition I wanted to make to the definition of the public sphere and what kind of expressions we are looking for when we are looking at the public sphere. When it comes to the question, what makes a healthy public sphere? And the panel is also called Normative and Empirical Insights. So I am defending a normative theory. I'm defending a normative angle for us to think about this question of what makes a healthy public sphere. And I will respond to this question, drawing on insights from the ARC project that was mentioned, that I'm currently working on together with Jordan, John, Claire is a partner as well. And the project is called Democratic Resilience, the Public Sphere and Extremist Attacks. So the question of what makes a healthy public sphere is at the core of this project, although we don't ask the question this way. So in this project, we are looking at the public sphere responses to violent extremist attacks, like the ones like the September 11 or the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand, in different democracies, and we have primary and secondary cases in different democracies, including Italy, Germany, UK, Australia, with respect to the Bali bombings. I mean, there wasn't a kind of a spectacular violent extremist attack in Australia, thankfully, but Australia was an active player in the public sphere, shaping the discussion on the Bali bombings. New Zealand is a case study as well, and we also drove on the way the US responded to violent extremist attacks as a sort of secondary case study, as a point of comparison. So our fundamental question in this project, by looking at how different public spheres are responding to similar kind of threats and attacks, is why do some public spheres prove to be fragile, experiencing polarization, fragmentation, or exclusion, like we saw, for example, or we sometimes still see, not only the September 11, like the you are either with us or with the terrorists kind of framing, while others prove resilient by sustaining an integrative discourse in the wake of extremist attacks. So an example that comes to mind is Jacinda Ardern's response to violent extremist attacks there, the Christchurch attacks. But also, for example, when there was a violent extremist attack in Norway, the Prime Minister then said, our response is more openness, more democracy, more humanity. Like, we are interested in understanding, well, is it something that is related to the personality of those prime ministers that sort of enable them? Are they priests? Like, what makes them to give that kind of a response, while others are really boiling to sort of, I guess, put their hate there and divide the society. So this is the kind of the fundamental question, why? And it's similar to the question that Zim asked yesterday. So I see also parallels there, like why are some democracies are doing so well in the face of external or internal threats and shocks, while others are sort of going into a panic mode. So to assess this and to say something about the public sphere in general, what is a good public sphere compared to the bad public sphere? Why is Sofia, for example, annoyed bringing Russia and the public sphere together? Like, in order to be able to distinguish the good from the bad and the ugly, so we need a normative angle. We can't just look at the public spheres and take their photos and have a photo album and say nothing. We need a normative angle. We need a direction. And I want to emphasize the role of normative theory. And in our project, we drove on the theory of deliberative democracy as a normative angle. You can think of a normative theory like a GPS. It gives you a direction, like you're doing stuff, but you have a direction. So it helps you to evaluate what makes a healthy public sphere. So, as a normative political project, deliberative democracy emphasizes the need for free, inclusive, and public discourse encompassing citizens and leaders. John already talked about deliberative democracy yesterday as well, and the kind of the ideas also shared in the chapter that he shared with you all, and I sort of share these kind of similar kind of approach, and in this project we are also using this approach. And it's usually defined as a talk-centric approach to democracy, and yes, we can understand talk in broader terms, including visuals, nonverbal, etc. And it has really high standards, high aspirations. We have to come together, we shouldn't be leaving anyone out, it has to be inclusive, we should listen to people and reflect and find a common ground. And some people criticize the deliberative approach for being sort of too idealistic, too high standards, and has sort of nothing to do with the reality. But if you actually think about it, I think any democratic approach is normative. Like liberal democracy sets a very, very high standard, and people don't talk about it, but hey, equality of all, freedom of all, human rights everywhere, these are fantastic aspirations. So any democratic ideal could set a normative standard. So I think it's important for us as scholars to be aware of our normative commitments, where we are coming from, where we want to go, to be able to assess what is healthy, what is unhealthy. So I am wrapping up, and the response, my short response, what makes a healthy public sphere is a democratically resilient public sphere. Drawing on the normative theory of deliberative democracy, we define democratic resilience as the ability of the public sphere, and here the public sphere is not an actor, I'm talking about the institutions and actors in the public sphere, to respond to extremist threats and attacks without losing its democratic credentials, democratic capacity understood in deliberative terms. So a resilient public sphere continues to facilitate an inclusion of diverse views, the communication across difference, even under shock. It continues to facilitate mutual respect, reasoned and reflective dialogue in response to disruption. And this requires institutions and actors that are competent. We also find many other things, how this might look in practice and who will facilitate that. But Jordan will reflect on some of those empirical findings. So I feel like I have to cut here. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Selen. Yeah, let's hand over to Jordan, of course. we are curious now about the findings and how different leaders react to these external threats.
Yeah, definitely. And thanks very much, Selen, for that delightful setup for me. So, you know, what do these democratically resilient public spheres look like in practice, right? What is a public sphere that sustains the kind of deliberative qualities that Selen has been talking about in the face of shocks, whether it's violent extremism, like we focus on, but it's also relevant for things like disaster recovery, you know, bushfires, floods, and that kind of thing. So in practice, based on our rather rich case studies of about 7 terror attacks across 5 democracies, as well as a suite of secondary cases, we kind of categorize these into 3 different kinds of responses. And there is a 4th theoretical possibility that doesn't actually exist. So the ones that we actually see in practice is the exacerbation of the kinds of damages caused by violent extremist attacks to the public sphere, a containment kind of response, and a counteracting response, one that's aimed at repairing the public sphere and perhaps even deepening the sort of democratic qualities in response to this crisis. And then there is a 4th theoretical possibility where the attack is just completely ignored, right? A leader doesn't even comment on it, which I just can't imagine that would actually happen. But it's theoretically possible, I suppose. So, you know, what does an exacerbation response look like? This would be, I suppose, a reinforcing of the violent extremist narrative. It would be inflaming community tensions as part of framing the attack as some kind of, you know, wider group struggle between, you know, the so-called West and the rest, let's say. And these kinds of framings and rhetorical strategies make the kind of nuanced deliberation that a democratically resilient public sphere from a deliberative democracy perspective, it just makes it completely impossible. So, for example, after a far-right shooting in Macerata in Italy in 2016, opposition politicians who ended up becoming, it took place during an election, and these opposition politicians end up becoming the government and eventually ministers, they laid the blame for the attack, which was committed by a neo-Nazi, at the feet of immigrants who were targeted, essentially saying it was their fault for being irregular migrants in Italy, so they basically deserved to be shot. So you have people like Matteo Salvini saying, you know, fueling this kind of hatred, saying things like, quote, "The moral responsibility lies with those who have filled Italy with illegal immigrants." So very much exacerbating that kind of damage to the public sphere. We have containment responses. This is the most kind of common approach. And these tend to emphasize inclusivity and unity, but very much at the national level. They're characterized by rhetorical strategies like emotional rerouting, like bridging and wedging, and attempting to really, I guess, deflate tensions. But at the same time, they're very depoliticizing. They really flatten any sort of power differentials within the polity. And we can see this, I guess, as solidarity and resilience in despite of difference. So we have discourses like More in Common in the UK after the murder of Joe Cox, a British Labour MP by a neo-Nazi. Discourses like United in Grief, which we saw in Germany after the Berlin Christmas market attack. And then there are a few instances of counteracting, of efforts really to repair. And these, I guess, can be categorized by solidarity through difference, right? As well as critical reflections on questions of identity and belonging and how these sort of factors of social imaginary might actually contribute or precipitate the kinds of events that we're looking at. And there's a real political risk and willingness to, I guess, listen and learn from the attack. So again, to pick up on the Ardern's response, saying things like to the Kiwi Muslim community, you know, we cannot know your grief, but we can walk with you, recognizing that there is some distinct differences here, acknowledging that, quote, we accept political engagement on these issues will not be easy, but facing up to the hard issues and having open public conversations are critical. So a real willingness to try and unpick some of these issues of identity that lead to or help produce a white supremacist shooter and an event like that. But of course, things become a little bit more difficult when we're talking about non-physically violent extremism. I mean, of course, ideologies like neo-Nazism are inherently violent, but what happens when the activities of neo-Nazis doesn't actually meet a criminal threshold? So we actually have my colleague Kurt Sengel at the University of Macquarie and I have a paper that's come out this morning in Media and Communications looking at the government's response to neo-Nazi activism in the state of Victoria in Australia. And so we argue that So the government introduced these sort of policy measures to ban initially the swastika, public display of the swastika, and then later other associated symbols and gestures. And we argue actually it's the discourses around this legislation that is more important for the deliberative qualities of the public sphere rather than the bans themselves, which are actually pretty useless. They're really easy to circumvent, doesn't actually make life harder for neo-Nazis, and has, I think, quite a negative effect in that it actually ends up securitizing the public sphere by extending the role of police and courts into the circulation of symbols. So here, the government sort of policy discourse aligns with best practice in crisis comms and also research on the far right, because it's a response that it doesn't just condemn the far right. It doesn't just say, you know, neo-Nazis aren't welcome and racism bad, but it actually quite actively tries to revitalize democracy and position or reposition Victoria as an inclusive community. So we have, for example, after neo-Nazis turned up at an anti-trans rally, Premier Daniel Andrews gets out there and says things like, quote, "To every trans Victorian I say this, our government will always support you, will always respect you, your rights are non-negotiable." We have Minister Hutchins, for example, on the Nazi gestures ban saying, "The harm caused by this hate conduct and vilification can be profound. It affects the physical and psychological well-being of individuals and prevents them from feeling comfortable and participating in their community." So there's this real acknowledgement of the sort of symbolic role and the harm that comes from this. And so the discursive response is overall sort of aimed at, you know, not just marginalizing extremes' voices, but also, you know, reaffirming an inclusive sense of community, positioning the government as responsive and listening, acknowledging and addressing the public sphere harms. And so we see this actually as quite a useful template, I suppose, for crisis communications in responding to neo-Nazi extremism, lessons which we hope will perhaps be applicable beyond Victoria. But we also sort of note in the paper, and I think this is important for the work Selen and I do, and Claire and John, talking about the role of leaders in responding to violent extremism, is that it requires buy-in from other public sphere actors, right? If political leaders are pulling one way and legacy media is pulling another, this can create some tension and sort of inhibit the containment or counteracting strategies that leaders might be trying to implement. So I'll hand over there.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Jordan. I thought that was a brilliant a presentation of how deliberative democracy can look in action, how different responses to extremist attacks look like, and also congratulations on your new paper. Wonderful. So, Ehsan, we're looking forward to hearing about a different view of democracy. What alternatives to deliberative democracy exist?
Sure. Well, thank you. And I'm not actually very sure that my view will be very different, because we're talking about very similar things here, I think, from the agonistic perspective and deliberative perspective. I think the main point of difference usually between the deliberative democracy and agonistic pluralism is not the process, it's usually what happens after consensus or the day after consensus. And we're not here to talk about the day after consensus because we haven't actually reached the consensus point. So let's talk about the process. My notes aren't as organized as Selen and Jordan, and I'm trying to talk about my points in a way that also talks about to your work as well. So sorry if I'm a bit all over the place, but I'm gonna start with I'm gonna start with some areas of my interest, what I have been doing and what I have seen and what it could mean. One of the things that I always look at, and Selen mentioned that deliberation doesn't always happen in form of verbal communication. It includes a lot of non-verbal communication as well. And I absolutely agree. And one of those forms of non-verbal communication that has always attracted my interest is actually the communication that does not happen. It's what we cannot see that I'm very interested in, not what we can see. And there's always a bias in the types of studies that we do in media and communication, where we go and collect some data. We say, well, this is what we can see. It shows antagonism, it shows polarization, it shows unity. but what about all the things that could be said, but were not? Or what about all those network formations that could form, but did not? That's what really is interesting for me. So, and it's admittedly one of the hardest things to study, because how can we study something that we cannot see? But I've been trying to do that, actually. My notes are actually about the question, what makes a healthy public sphere? And there are many things that could lead to a healthy public sphere, all along 4 dimensions: structure, materiality, agency, and discourse. I'm trying to focus only on one thing that I've been seeing, and to see which one I should focus on and I should answer, I looked at the core of the question, which is democracy, or demos, or people. So let's actually go back to people alone, what we do as people, what we should do normatively, and what we have been doing. Of course, reflecting on what we cannot see. I've done a few studies on the Australian Twitter sphere on both topics that are inherently polarizing, like immigration discourses, discourses around Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, robo-debt. I've also done studies on Reddit and political communication in and between political subreddits, and a couple of studies on Gap, which is arguably a far-right social media platform. And I see very striking similarities in all of them, which are a little bit concerning, but also tell a lot about exactly what are some of those things that could be done or said but weren't. One of the things that we always see in any political study on Twitter communication when we construct something like a retweet network is that there's always a blob of right-wing users, the far-right, conservatives, ultra-conservatives, and there are so many clusters of left-leaning users, like a big blob of left-leaning users, but comprised of many subclusters. There's always one big cluster of far-right. So, and I was talking to Francesco today, well, like, does that mean that we only have one right-leaning discourse in Australia or beyond, or not? And ironically, a lot of things that we expect the left to be doing better, unfortunately, the right is doing better these days. Like, they present a very united front. They have united on all the topics that are categorized as conservative perspectives, right-leaning perspectives, far right-leaning perspectives, and they formed what I selfishly call network discursive alliances. Like, they use the materialities of online communication to join an alliance and form that united front. So I looked at what, of course, and speaking of Reddit and Gap, that the same process happens. When you're trying to find political subreddits, you can see so many more left-leaning subreddits, but far fewer right-leaning ones. Some of the more extremist ones were, of course, banned or removed by Reddit, like the Donald. But even the more, let's call them moderate or safer right-leaning and conservative spaces on Reddit, there are far fewer right-leaning ones on Reddit than left-leaning ones. So we went and collected the data. We looked at if users contribute to several right or left-leaning subreddits or not. And the funny thing is that they don't. So if someone joins the R progressive, they tend to post only in R progressive and not post in R liberal. We looked at what they say about each other, and you can very interestingly see that in R progressive, people call the other ones pseudo-liberals, and the vice versa. So there's a lot of internal fight going on from people that we normatively expect to deliberate. They don't. And that led me to another concerning observation on these digital spaces, which I call active passivity, so the question was, well, I'm not seeing deliberation, I'm not seeing conflict, I'm not seeing contestation, and I'm not even seeing antagonism in form of direct clashes. So what's going on? Is it because they don't see each other? Is it because they're not aware of the existence of the other or the enemy? Or is it because the algorithm shapes the platform in a way that they don't even get exposed to the information? Are they living in filter bubbles and echo chambers? And the answer was no. They're acutely aware of the presence of the other, because when it comes to mentioning, when it comes to attacking, they know who to attack, they know who to target. When it comes to talking about topics that they should be talking about, they remain silent. So this passivity that we observe is not because they avoid being exposed to things. They do get exposed to things, but they choose not to interact with it. They choose to remain silent. They choose not to respond, or they choose not to talk about topics that are discursively dissonant. And that's the concerning thing to me, because no matter if we look at it from the perspective of agonistic pluralism or deliberative democracy, the first thing that we need is to people to actually engage, to talk to each other, to either antagonize each other, deliberate rationally, emotionally, fight. But if all we see is silence and passivity, what does it tell us about the public sphere? And as I mentioned, the concerning thing is the ironic observation and the paradoxical observation that this happens more on the left, where a lot of disagreement is on smaller topics of how best to build the healthy public sphere, while the anti-democratic part, the right-leaning, the far-right party, well, because they want to destroy something, they can easily unite, no matter what anti-democratic belief they hold. The core is that they are anti-democratic, right? But the disagreements and those alliances that should be forming on the left and whatever we define the left or the progressive side, unfortunately don't. So what makes a healthy public sphere is engagement in any form, whether it's deliberation or antagonism. And how we can get to that engagement, honestly, I don't know. But I know that we should get there.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you, Ehsan. I think that was such an important contribution to the debate, because you made visible in a way that the existence of disagreement is better than not engaging at all, right? So a healthy public sphere needs these kinds of connections, the kinds of disagreements, also the emotive, passionate encounters which are part of this healthy public sphere. So we heard about another pathology. I feel like maybe we should have called it the unhealthy public sphere. We'll turn to a final ill that strikes the public sphere today, disinformation, misinformation, and then the potential cure of fact-checking. So over to you, Michelle.
Is this one on?
Yeah, it's just for the recording.
Sorry about that. It's just funny you say about a potential cure, because I think that's one of the questions we get the most is, does fact-checking work? And, you know, like everything, it depends what it's trying to achieve. So I'll talk a bit about what fact-checkers have said. But just to riff off Ehsan, the whole idea that no communication is a communication act, that's really important for the work that I do, which looks at science and media and institutions that are trying to, I guess, speak back to science or democratise science. And yeah, you can't assume that because people are not talking, they don't have a thoughts or concerns about it. I think it comes back to what John said yesterday about epistemic justice and being able to articulate what you think. So I could say a lot about science, but I'm going to talk about fact-checking because of the recent attacks we've seen on fact-checkers in the US and recently Australia around The Voice, and also, yeah, what fact-checking says about the future-proofing the public sphere. And just to put things into context, there's a whole international institutional movement of fact-checking, a lot of funding coming from either platforms, governments, all sorts of various areas pieced together to, I guess, hold up this norm of objectivity around political journalism. So seeing fact-checking as a way to disrupt mis and disinformation flows online for this healthy or vibrant democracy. And political fact-checkers, I think, are we've spoken to them, and I'll tell you a little bit about what they said, but establish this common ground of hard facts. That's, you know, I recently went to the conference and facts matter is their cry. And I think we've talked about some of the problems with that, but corresponding with this accepted, I guess, you know, accepted construction of reality based on this positivist and objectivist approach to understanding the world. And when we've talked to fact checkers in Latin America, Australia, and also South Africa. And I want to talk about the Australian fact checkers because of these recent attacks. But we talked with them about what they thought was their vision of their contribution to healthy and vibrant democracies. And they saw themselves as supporting audience members in re-establishing constructive dialogue with others, to get them the correct information. So they really saw themselves as filling this deficit, as well as getting politicians to stop saying stupid and harmful things. So that seemed like an achievement. So when we're thinking about what fact-checking, does fact-checking work? There's very different aims for different fact-checkers. Some of them saw themselves as supporting audience, having an educational role. So really, particularly around COVID-19 vaccines, taking that explanatory journalism role to, you know, convey complexity and nuance for better public decision-making. So real public good stuff. But it was also modelled on this idea of civic debate. So civil conversations, taking emotions out of deliberations, avoiding personal attacks and focusing on evidence and facts. So this real imaginary around how we think of, you know, a vibrant public sphere. Yeah, some of them implemented right of reply policies for politicians to get constructive dialogue going with those that they fact-checked. They fact-checked, when they fact-checked, they published everything. So whether it was true, whether a claim was true or false, so across the whole gamut for transparency. And also, also recognised that context and framing were important. And I think this is where some of the challenges are. The whole normative idea of what they did when it came to reality could be really problematic because there are, I guess, methodologies that fact checkers follow. So things like selecting political campaign-related statements to verifying numerous political claims in one fact check, or even things like using truth scales from true to false. They said that those were some of the things that they had the most challenging, challenging response with, that they weren't working, which some of them are the groundwork of the methodologies of fact checkers. So I think the whole idea that if you don't believe in facts, it's pretty hard, to fact check. And I think it gets to some of the things that people were talking about yesterday, we've got this factual belief polarisation, and I've talked to Katerina about this a bit. It's complicated by these activities of partisan actors where you've got these network models of knowledge or identity-based knowledge of models, and that's where they really struggled in terms of context and thinking about what they do in contrast to institutional understandings of knowledge. And, Ehsan, we'll talk about it's all information to someone, but really struggling with that idea of, facts and values together in their roles because they're paid, to focus on facts. So I think when it came to things like COVID, climate change, the things to do with democratising science and really getting to people's values around what they cared about, it was very hard to get away from some of these, I guess, institutional problems. And I think you mentioned institutional competence, and I think that was one thing that came up is trying to do this work despite flawed institutions. So they imagine their audience as readers or viewers with moderate views, and I think this was an important thing for us to explore. So those who often had a deficit in knowledge of issues, so that deficit model thinking, rather than going out to change somebody's mind, or thinking about the gamut of people across the whole public sphere. And I think this choice of audience could have significant implications when it comes to that legitimacy of data used for decision making. So it depended on, public trust in official institutionally recognised data. That's the focus and the challenge. So they considered the Australian public to be relatively trusting at the moment, but seeing what's happened in the US and seeing those themes coming through in Australia, there's a real concern about what will happen within local context for fact checkers. And also that, this, I guess, fear of flood of synthetic information coming from AI and the visual, being able to really deal with some of that. So yeah, I guess I'd like to conclude with saying that, there's this new debunking model of fact checking, which it's like a public health model that citizens need to be protected from themselves, that the amplification of misinformation is spread by citizens. So rather than seeing citizens as necessarily these rational people who need the correct information to make decisions, they're being paid by platforms and by other funding sources to essentially get pieces of misinformation off platforms, rather than thinking about that that idea of credibility of democratic and evidence-based systems of government. So I think a lot of them felt like that's where their work needed to lie, thinking about who are these actors who are the larger picture of really discrediting institutions, but what they were funded for was this particular, not politicians, not that top-down amplification, but thinking about citizens as problems. And I think that's a bit of a shift that we're seeing that, might be exacerbated.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle. That was really insightful, and I think we've heard such a rich different versions of what the public sphere needs to entail, what a healthy public sphere needs, all the shocks that the public sphere is exposed to, and potential remedies. So now I would like to pass it over to you to discuss what are your questions in response to the panel, what would you like to hear more of, what was left out, what are your contributions, your critical reflections on the panel, just to give everybody a chance to wake up a bit and share your ideas with everyone on your table. We'll do that for around 10 minutes, and then we'll collect a couple of questions and then pass it back to the panel to wrap up.
One of my concerns was that I'm probably the only person not doing deliberative democracy, and then I read John's chapter and he was critiquing the agonists, but when I read his version of deliberative democracy, it's very close to what the basic agonistic models and say. It's just really different terminology and different emphasis points, but it's the same thing for me.
Sharing of perspectives, not seeing people getting together as necessarily, I guess, having to have the answer, but just getting people talking and being one of the biggest problems. And that's
the inclusion of contestations and passions into the deliberative model. That fixes a lot of things.
And leadership, I mean, that's what I think for the work that we're doing, they're saying that they're trying to create these really healthy debate systems despite the work of politicians. So that's really where I think for your work, it's very hard to do your job despite your leadership, So I think it's wonderful reading that and just seeing the connections.
What do you see, Hans, as connections or highlights for you?
Well, I always...
You work in this, Hans also works with deliberative theory, but also agonistic perspectives as well,
Yeah, I think in theory, agonistic and deliberative perspectives are quite close, and also the way you talked about agonism was very compatible. But then when I thought about the two empirical cases, what would agonists say about the extremist attacks and the leaders' responses? And what would agonists say about fact-checking? Fact-checking, I think, is even more, probably more different. think if it comes to the empirical analysis and the focus where you look, I think it might be quite different. Because you even talked about how like discourse should be rational and not emotional, which might fit with original versions of deliberative democracy, but agonists would really intervene and say like that's not what we are looking for. So maybe when it comes to the empirical analysis, there are differences. Yeah.
I think when it comes to the empirical, like I work with agonistic theories as well, and in fact we are seeing agonistic pluralism part of a deliberative approach as well. If you're not taking an outdated approach to deliberation, which focuses on consensus, which was early Habermas first. But I think the main difference I see between an agonistic and deliberative perspective is that in the deliberative perspective, you're trying to generate the common ground. Common ground in some senses is both your starting point.
Understanding? Is common ground understanding, or does it have to be agreement? Can it be?
Exactly. It can be super thin, it can be, yes, but it's something that is shared. Whereas with agonistic approach, I think their starting point is that it's impossible to have, we are so different from each other that it's impossible to find that, like it would be compromising on our individual identities to come together to sort of manufacture consensus where it doesn't exist or something like that. So that's the kind of, I think they are similar approaches, but they have different desirable outcomes. Whereas from an agonistic perspective, show must go on. There should be contestation all the time. Contestation, identity transformation, but there is no like a collective that comes together, that shares, even however thin it is, a kind of a common ground.
I think the point isn't that there should be contestation, the point is that there will be contestation.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, the starting point is, you're right, that antagonism is ineradicable, so you can never get rid of that thing. But there is an emphasis on the common ground, which is like equality, liberty, justice, and everything.
Yeah,
And
okay.
the point is that as long as both parties do agree on these core values, they can have the antagonism. I think one of
So that's where the agreement is on we're all working on the same playing field.
Yeah.
We have very different views.
true. The point of difference would be that agreement sometimes just comes in form of having a common enemy instead of having a common ground.
Yeah.
So, which for the deliberative model, I think,
Find somebody else.
that may not come into this. And one of the points that I've seen critique of agonistic pluralism a lot is the word antagonism, which many people see as equating conflict, while antagonism is of that meaning-making, discursive level. Like, agonism itself is a positive form of antagonism.
Yeah, we wrote on that with
Yeah.
Hans, yeah.
Yes.
Sort of bringing a positive understanding of antagonism, how sometimes you have to, how do you define it? Like you have to...
I mean, there are positive aspects of distraction, right?
Distraction,
Distraction
yes,
can
yes.
play a role in democracy.
Distracting patriarchy, for example, and democratically antagonistic projects.
That is true, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's generative, is that what you mean? Like it would be democratically
Yeah.
and test, you know, we just accept that everybody understands that we are. That's where, I guess that's where I struggle a bit with the whole thing of debate is what's acceptable, because a lot of the work I've done is in scientific institutions where it's like, we want everybody's opinion, but we don't want it to be too inflammatory. Does that make sense? So the political work about we understand how you feel, that's very different from let's get everybody together. Nobody wants to have that, you know, the forum where you get everybody together. It feels like it's got to be that kind of civil debate. Whereas online it can be very different. You can observe those conversations because they come up. So people speak back in ways that they wouldn't in top-down processes. You probably, I mean, you've thought about this a lot more than me, but
No, I think, yeah.
I only certainly know from those democratising science areas, I probably won't mention it because we're being recorded. Chief Scientist Office when nanotechnology was first. They're saying, let's have upstream engagement. So they did a kind of citizen jury or citizen mob where they invited people, but Friends of the Earth got wind and said, hey, why aren't you inviting people? And they said, oh, well, it's not that kind of process. And they're going, you're going to create a report and say, look, in Queensland, we're really happy with a nanotechnology. You're missing whole big segments. You know, and what I love about social media, because I'm getting a positive, like the positive side, is that there have been those speaking back, the hijacking of hashtags when there's been publicly open deliberations or March for Science where people have had the opportunity to speak back because there's, it feels like government processes want the powers to government. But I feel like I'm not from the political side.
No, you're bang on. I mean, we're doing some work with the New South Wales government at the moment. There's a lot of conversation around, we need to restore the trust deficit. They always see that as unidirectional, right? Citizens don't trust us. Why wouldn't they trust us? We're so trustworthy. But, I mean, the big question for me is always, like, how much do you trust citizens? Like, not at all. And they're like, oh, fuck, yeah, you're right. Like, shit, that is a problem, isn't it? It's like, yeah, it is. It's like, so, yeah.
The thing that Queensland government is seeing how they're going to address that trust in science through citizen science, and that's seen as participatory. They're seeing that as a way of essentially replacing things like citizen juries or citizen or public sphere. They're going, we're involving people in science, but all they're doing is like word counts or like rubbish counts. Or it's not spreading back to the idea of institutional change.
It's so highly extractionary. It's getting free labour out of you as well.
Absolutely, yes, and that's what they're
Pretty clever policy making, but
funding
a bit dodgy,
instead of these engagement issues.
That's, I mean, and again, in like our relationship with the New South Wales government is we're developing a deliberative democracy toolkit with them, and it's very much their current. I mean, the team we're working with is great. Like, really buy into it and want to like influence across the board. But more broadly, it's very much like citizen engagement is this afterthought that they have to do to tick a box. They've already got their policy in place. They want it. Let's go talk to a couple of people so they can say they did it. It's not doing it at the wrong end of the process.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
With very much the wrong intent.
Social license to
Exactly.
Okay, so I'd like to focus your attention
More often.
to the panel again. We had our own deliberations here and developed our own questions. So we'll bring it back here, and we would love to hear from you. What were some of the burning questions that came up? What are some comments in reflection to the panel of what makes a healthy public sphere? I suggest that we collect a couple and then pass it on to the panel to answer all of them collectively in the interest of time and also in the interest of hearing from many of you. So yeah, go ahead. Who has a question, comment, idea? Back and then I'll come to you.
Hi, everyone. I think I'm that kind of person who attends a workshop and says, it's more of a comment than a question. So, but what we were discussing here was that things that I've noted have come up again and again recently is about why is it that the left seems not to be as successful as the right. And so in a very brief conversation here, I think what we landed on initially was that, as Adele said, maybe it's the conservative approach towards, it's easier breaking things than building things for that matter, for example. And then I think where I see some connections, and Jordan, I would really like to hear your thoughts on that, is maybe there's some connection with populist approach as well, when you've got one leader or one person to look up to, and then look up to them deciding what you're going to do and what your next plan of action is. And maybe, unfortunately, people on the left that I also perceive myself to be part of, might be losing on one end, where I think there's too many active stimulant brains, and there are too many thoughts, and then too many there's a lot of individualism, I think. So maybe, I don't know if that is where we are lacking, we know a pathway, so everybody is trying to build their own path and lacking at organizing or collectivism. So I would really like to listen, I mean, coming from a war zone and growing up in a war zone, and from a country that is ruled by a terrorist extremist organization right now, I would like to hear your thoughts on what's happening, where are we lacking?
Wonderful, thank you. I'll pass it on to Sophia.
Thank you. Yesterday's panels, asking today's panels. My question to the deliberative democracy team. You talk a lot about, Jordan as well, about the responses of politicians, what the discourses should be. My question is about what normative theory tells us or can tell us about the role of the platforms in this crisis communication. So is it an act of deliberative democracy, let's say, for platforms to allow the broadcast of the Christchurch massacre attack? Is it the, takedown of Donald Trump from several platforms? Is it an act of, again, deliberation and democracy, or simple censorship? So for me, it's interesting, like, how do you see this interrelation between, politicians, different actors, and also what role platforms play from normative perspective?
Our table had a vibrant discussion around the question of, are you participating, or do you know of communities of practice that are international in nature, ideally, that are collaborating on a healthy public sphere? And then, so that was the question. And then we answered the question amongst ourselves about who should be in the room versus who would want to be in the room, like who will put their hand up, i.e. industry, consultants, policymakers, who often don't know what experts to listen to. But collectively, we started a list of who should be in the room. And the first one was behavioral economists, philosophers, everyday people, think the citizen jury model, Indigenous knowledge holders, activists, and scholars. And then we discussed Meta's oversight board and what's not working with that. But, are you participating in international communities of practice to make a healthy public sphere? And if so, tell us who they are, and if you could imagine one, who should be in the room, if you could create one.
Great, thank you. Questions over here, yeah?
I was wondering, after listening to what makes a healthy public sphere, and if one of the symptoms of not having a healthy public sphere, especially if we look at the online or social media platforms, and what you were saying, is that people are not engaging with each other. After doing some work, I think about the work of Chelsea Watego, and how, if you look now, obviously Twitter is not the same, but even like Black Twitter in the US or Indigenous Twitter, the community purposely chooses to not engage with White Australia, for instance, here. And this doesn't mean, so it's kind of an in-group conversation, but it's not a symptom of an unhealthy public sphere. It's a public sphere that works on their own terms. So sometimes I wonder whether when we do this kind of big data analysis, or we have these symptoms, like we also talk about what a public healthy sphere is from our own perspective and lenses. So if we center the voices or interest of historically marginalized groups, I mean, it could be the same with feminist, like public spheres. So I wonder, like, if you could just reflect, all of you, about this too, like, because sometimes there's, people are tired of engaging, and it's more just like focusing on attention of growing your own community and making a public sphere for your peers. So yeah.
Thank you. Just building on that again too, and we had a really interesting discussion about both what leaders, what are leaders in the first place, whether it's just political leaders or others as well, but then also about where we actually draw the line around what is healthy public deliberation and where that stops. And it seems that in a number of your presentations, this actually came to the fore as well. And I would even go as far as saying that throughout the history of the public sphere, it's been in a struggle about where we draw the boundaries, the brackets around healthy public deliberation. So Jordan, when you talked about the Victorian bans on Nazi symbols, for instance, that's basically a legal way of saying this is not protected speech, this is prohibited speech. We don't argue with Nazis. You are not part of public deliberation because you represent a hateful, destructive ideology. Ehsan, when you talked about active passivity, in a sense, that's also a more personal choice, perhaps, or communal choice to say, well, some groups are just not part of who we feel comfortable or prepared, or who we think we can meaningfully deliberate with, because they are just outside of the bounds of what is acceptable. Michelle, with fact checkers as well, I mean, the choices that they make also are about where there is a place for public deliberation, where there isn't. There is no fact checker that would fact check Holocaust denialism, for instance, because that matter is settled. So there's no point going over that again. So in some ways, and I would go as far as saying really throughout, there has been this ongoing contestation about where we draw the lines. We talked about this in the context of essentially what is acceptable, that in the past perhaps there was a much narrower area of debate that was possible, where certain topics just weren't acceptable to talk about. Maybe even women's rights, LGBTIQ rights, and so on were kind of not part of public debate, and advocates for those rights were kind of excluded from white male public debate. And then as we went on, of course, some of these things became acceptable to talk about. We're now even at a point where questioning capitalism overall is acceptable, which for a long time in Western societies it hasn't been, and you'd be seen as a communist radical or whatever. But at the same time, the far right is, of course, pushing that Overton window in the other direction as well. And we're now at a point where in some societies, white supremacism is actually a matter for debate again, rather than just something that automatically excludes you from public deliberation. So there is this constant struggle over where the boundaries are. And I guess what I'm getting to is a normative question of how do we draw that line? How do we negotiate that line? How do we push it perhaps back to something that is more acceptable and more healthy for the public sphere?
Okay, wonderful. Is there any last, final, urgent question to add? If not, yeah, one question, a quick one, please, and then we'll pass it back. Yeah.
We were arguing who would like to actually make our various discussions into formal questions. The easiest question we had was about affect and emotions, thinking of the claim of the similar public outpouring of affect of a Donald Trump rally and a Taylor Swift concert, but in terms of also the history of deliberative democracy and the very sort of rational study of deliberation and accepting emotions but not really centralizing what they mean. And we had a question about how each of the panelists study emotion or sort of look at emotion and affect in their work. And then we had an attached question about, I forget the actual reference, but discussing agonism and deliberation as two different things or opposing things, and perhaps whether affect or culture comes into it, but when certain activity is agonism and when it's deliberation, and how that relates to whether you're claiming something is healthy or unhealthy in your research.
Great, thanks so much for adding this question. I think it's a very important one. So we'll give a challenge to the speakers. Each gets 1 minute, maybe a little bit more, to respond. So pick your favorite questions. It won't be possible to answer them all fully, probably, but we'll have a break afterwards, and we'll have still lots of discussions over the course of the day. So what I suggest is that Jordan starts, and then we'll just pass it along the panel, and you each get about 1 minute, please.
Okay, great. Clock running. I might jump to Sophia's question because I think actually from a deliberative perspective, things like content moderation is extremely important because it's about holding space so that the largest number of people can participate in a conversation. So Twitter or X becoming a Nazi cesspool has meant lots of other people, particularly from marginalised identities, have withdrawn understandably from that platform. So I think there is a good deliberative case to be made that actually censorship can be helpful or useful to create space for other people. And on the question of Axel around where do we draw the lines, I think that's an incredibly important point and something I'm very aware of and reflexive about in my own work is like, and part of the problem I see with the Nazi bans is that it exceptionalizes white supremacy, racism, all these exclusionary discourses and ideologies as this problem of the fringes and the extreme. Whereas, as I think you know quite well, a lot of it's mainstreamed. There's a lot of sort of porous boundaries between these two. So I think that legislating these bans is ineffective. I'm not losing sleep over. I'm not like upset that Nazi symbols are banned. I just think if that's all they're doing, while federal politicians will still spout off about the Great Replacement or white South African genocide and stuff like this, I think what the hell's the point, right? Like that's where the problem is, I think.
Thank you. So in my 1 minute, I will make multiple points. I guess in terms of international communities of practice to improve the health of the public sphere, I see a big role in journalism and journalists, and I don't know if they would sort of call themselves as the guardians of the public sphere, but I feel like most contemporary journalism is failing us, not because it is biased, but because they are working with the outmoded notions of balance and objectivity when they want to bring both sides of a debate where the other side actually doesn't exist. So you can't be balanced and objective about people who deny the climate crisis or who support the neo-Nazi groups, etc. So there are controversies where you don't have actually both sides. Don't manufacture this in the name of journalism. So I see a big role in journalists in protecting the health of the public sphere, and they should be part of the communities of practice collaborating on healthy public sphere. My next very quick point is around another very important function of the public sphere. Like we have been discussing in the context of this workshop mainly about the communicative functions of the public sphere. But the public sphere also has an identity building function. And in terms of when we think about the boundaries of the public sphere or whom are we talking to or not talking to, etc., I think we also imagined the publics, the others. So when we sort of put forward speech acts, and especially if you're thinking about the scale of the public sphere, it's the communication amongst strangers. So we don't know, but it's also a side where we generate ways of relating to each other. Who are we? It's a side where we generate our collective imagination. And maybe relating to Ehsan's project and points, like maybe it's the far right or the sort of more conservative groups. They are doing a really good job on creating the solid identity, them versus us kind of narrative, whereas left is not sort of so united on that kind of front. So we have to think about the identity building, collective identity generating function of the public sphere as well. So.
Thanks. Maybe I'll start with what Bernadette's table were talking about who would be involved in a transnational, and I've been involved in quite a few local kinds of deliberative processes, and you're flat out doing something within a city, let alone thinking beyond that. And I think one of the issues is, one of the things we talked about at our table is a lot of these processes, they need funding, and funding comes from governments, and we talked about the whole idea that they're often set up to be a social license to operate. So the whole idea of trust, and as Jordan mentioned, governments will say, well, citizens don't trust us. And as he said, well, do you trust citizens as governments? And I think that speaks to some of the things I've been involved in where people are excluded because they're not trusted to deliberate in effective ways. So things around nanotechnology, climate change. We've seen things like climate champions who are funded in Australia to do work in mitigation with their communities, so how to actually think about adapting, I should say, to climate change. As soon as they decide they want to lobby, no way. So you've got to move outside. So Farmers for Climate Action, those groups have a really important role outside of the funded processes, but you do need means of production, and I think that is the positive of social media. So hashtag communities, March for Science was a huge thing for speaking back to science about what we want to see with our science institutions, not just seeing it positively. So a lot going on, but I guess, who's got the means of production will determine, I suppose, who's involved and how deliberation is, I guess, articulated or conceived.
Well, this is a very tough task to respond in 1 minute. I'm trying to respond to a few questions at the same time. Ariadna's, Axel's, Aisha's point, and Sam's point about the role of affects in agonism. And well, with active passivity and a refusal to engage, I'm not necessarily talking about refusal to engage with the other enemy. The concerning point is a refusal to engage with the other adversary. People who share the same values as us, like equality, liberty, justice. But the emphasis on one's identity becomes so much that the maintenance of identity becomes the primary goal, not joining the other people with similar identities. That's the big thing that happens. So I'm not sure what the best example is to put it, but I can think of a metaphor of a restaurant menu where identities are packaged either into set menus rather than a la carte options. So you can't pick your choices. You have to choose a package of identities. If you're Democrat, you should be anti-gun, pro-life in the context of the United States. If you're Republican, you should be pro-gun, God-loving, pro-life, not pro-choice, and the other. So that's the big thing that happens. And the observation I had about the several clusters on the left is exactly a lack of engagement with other adversary, with people who aren't necessarily against us or saying the opposite of what we are saying. They're saying the same thing from a different perspective. But those alliances don't form because the maintenance of identity has taken priority over joining alliances towards progress, towards a better society. And that I see as a paradox of rationality, actually, because on the left, a lot of issues that we discuss and debate over are issues of rational argumentation and studying and going from A to Z in an argumentation, but because we want to change. And because of this process of thinking, there will be disagreement, there will be differences of opinion, and there will be several groups of identity. While, as Aisha said, if you want to conserve the status quo, just conserve it. And there's no disagreement because we don't want to change anything. So the observation that people do not engage isn't inherently bad. It becomes bad when they don't engage with other identities who share the same values. Like feminists do not talk to, let's say, and I'm thinking of a very extreme hypothetical example, when feminists refuse to talk to trans rights activists, when Black rights activists refuse to talk to immigrant rights activists because they say, well, we are Black, we are feminist, we are trans, we are immigrants. all of them are looking for equality. All of them are looking for freedom. All of them are looking for justice. But instead of equality for all, it becomes equality for me. And the priority takes, the identity takes priority. That's the most concerning part for me. When these divisions are along identity lines rather than signifiers that are the core values of democratic projects.
Wonderful, thank you. It's really hard to close a panel with such brilliant speakers. We could probably talk forever. We'll continue the conversations in the break.